They put me in a body bag. I wasn't unconscious, I wasn't dreaming, I was already somewhere else entirely. And I watched them zip it closed. Before this is over, you'll understand what I saw on the other side, and why coming back to that body was the very last thing I wanted to do. That night I had no pulse, no breath, no brain activity the monitors could detect. The doctors had already made their decision, and I was gone. Not the way people say someone is gone when they mean lost or distant or unreachable. Truly gone, as in no longer there, as in somewhere no map has ever charted and no language has ever fully named. I didn't know it then. You never do in the moment, but looking back now, I understand something I couldn't explain for years. What happened after they zipped that bag wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something I'm still finding words for. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about where we go when we leave. Where we go. That question followed me for a long time before that night. I just never thought I'd find out the answer the way I did. My name is Vinney, and what I'm about to tell you is the most true thing I've ever said out loud. I was 26 years old when it happened, living in a small apartment on the east side of a city that didn't have much use for people like me. Working nights at a warehouse, sleeping days, eating whatever was fast and cheap and close. Nothing remarkable about my life up to that point, no great tragedy, no divine calling, no particular reason the universe would single me out for something like this. Just a young man moving through the world without much thought about what any of it meant or where it was heading. I wasn't unhappy. That matters to me to say because people always assume the ones who end up in these stories must have been suffering in some particular way, as if the universe only sends messengers to the ones who are already broken open. That wasn't true for me. I was ordinary, functional, getting through. That changed on the night of March 14th. I remember the date because it's printed on every document they gave me afterward, the hospital report, the discharge summary, the letter from the attending physician that I still keep in a drawer and take out sometimes when I need to remind myself that I didn't imagine any of this. March 14th, the night my heart stopped for 4 minutes and 31 seconds. That number is not something I'm approximating, it is documented. It is in the medical record. The resuscitation team logged the return of pulse at 11:47 p.m. and the flat line had been recorded beginning at 11:42 p.m. and 16 seconds. 4 minutes, 31 seconds measured by people who had no reason to embellish it and every professional reason to be exact. I know this because I asked every nurse, every doctor, every person who would sit with me long enough to answer. I needed to know exactly how long I had been absent from this world, because I needed to match that number against what I'd experienced on the other side. And what I had experienced did not feel like 4 minutes and 31 seconds. It felt like years. I had gone out that evening with no particular destination, restless in the way young men get when something is missing but they can't identify what. I ended up at a gas station, bought a coffee I didn't finish, then drifted to a parking lot, then found myself walking a stretch of road I'd never walked before. The kind of directionless movement that doesn't feel like a decision because it isn't one. It's just the body going somewhere, while the mind is elsewhere, circling something it can't name. I don't remember being hit. I remember the road. I remember the particular smell of that night, cold and damp, the way air feels just before a weather system moves through and changes everything. I remember a sound in the distance, low and rushing, like something large approaching from somewhere I couldn't see. And then I remember nothing of this world at all. What I remember next is somewhere else. Not darkness, not the absence of sensation you might imagine when you picture what unconsciousness feels like from the outside. Something else entirely. Something that was, in every way I am capable of measuring, more real than the road I had just been standing on. I've tried to describe this to people over the years, doctors, therapists, friends who asked, and then went quiet when I actually started answering. The honest truth is that the language doesn't reach, but I'll try the same way I always try, imperfectly, carefully, knowing I'm reaching for something that lives just past the edge of what words can hold. The first thing I noticed was the light. Not a light, not a source with a location and a direction you could point to. The light. As if light had always been a background beneath everything, a frequency the noise of living was always too loud to hear, and in that moment, finally, the noise had stopped. And there it was. Waiting? I moved toward it, and I've never been sure which is more accurate. It moved toward me. Maybe both happened at the same time. Maybe in that place, the difference between approaching and being approached doesn't exist the way it does here. Maybe distance itself operates on different rules when you've left the body behind, and the rules that govern this world no longer apply. What I know is that within moments of becoming aware of it, I was inside it, surrounded by it. And the word surrounded isn't quite right either, because that implies an outside, and there was no outside. There was only this, warmth without temperature, presence without form, a kind of knowing that didn't come through the eyes or the ears or any of the channels I'd always used to make sense of the world. I just knew things, not facts. Not information in the way you'd read it off a page or hear it from someone across a table. Something deeper than that, something closer to recognition, like remembering something you never consciously learned, something that had been living underneath your awareness the entire time, waiting patiently for the noise to clear, long enough for you to finally hear it. I knew I was not alone. I knew I had never been alone. And I knew, with a certainty I cannot explain and have never been able to shake loose from, that what I was experiencing was not a hallucination, not a dream, not the brain misfiring in the last desperate seconds before shutdown. This was arrival. That word came to me later when I was lying in a hospital bed trying to reconstruct what had happened. Arrival. Because that's what it felt like. Not an ending. Not a dissolution into nothing. A destination reached after a journey so long I had forgotten I was on it. I want to pause here and say something important. I know how this sounds to someone who hasn't been there. I know the clinical explanations that exist for experiences like mine. Oxygen deprivation to the brain, temporal lobe stimulation, endorphin release under extreme physical stress. I've read them all. I've sat with them for years. I have genuine respect for the people who constructed those frameworks. But here is what the frameworks don't account for. When I regained consciousness in that emergency room, when the nurses were calling my name and the lights were too bright and everything in my body hurt in a way I had no vocabulary for, one of the attending physicians came to check on me. Dr. Elaine Marsh. Her name is on the discharge paperwork. She leaned over me and asked how I was feeling, and before I could answer, I told her something I had no business knowing. I told her I had heard her during the resuscitation. Not seen, heard. I told her she had said to one of the nurses, at some point while my pulse was absent, that she needed more hands in the room and that someone should call down to the 3rd floor. She went still. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that isn't performed, that doesn't have a follow-up procedure attached to it, and then, quietly, she asked me how I could possibly know that. I didn't have an answer for her then. I still don't have a clean one now. What I have is what I heard. And what I heard, while my heart was not beating and my brain was receiving no measurable signals, was a room full of people working to pull me back from somewhere I wasn't certain I wanted to leave. Because where I was, I want to be careful here. I want to get this right. Where I was felt like home in a way that no physical place I have ever stood has matched. Not the house I grew up in, not any room I ever loved. Home in a way that had nothing to do with the location and everything to do with recognition. Like finally reaching the thing you didn't know you had been searching for. And that should have been everything. That should have been the whole story, but there was something else in that light, something I hadn't expected to find there, something that changed the meaning of the word waiting, and everything I thought I understood about why we are here, in a way I was not prepared for. There was someone there, not a shape exactly, not a silhouette in the way you'd picture one if I told you to close your eyes and imagine a figure standing in light. It was more like a presence that had weight, that had personality, that had a particular quality, unmistakable and specific, that I recognized before I understood what recognizing it meant. I need to say something carefully here. My father passed away when I was 19, cardiac failure, sudden, no warning the family had been given. One morning he was there and by the afternoon he was not, and I spent the 7 years between his death and that night on the road doing what a lot of young men do, which is move forward without ever fully stopping to feel the size of what had been taken. You learn to carry the absence. You learn to talk around it. You learn to say, "My father passed," in a tone that signals the conversation doesn't need to go further, and most people respect that signal and don't press. They nod and change the subject, and you're grateful for it. What I had never done in 7 years was grieve him the way he deserved to be grieved. And now, in this place that had no ceiling and no floor and no coordinates I could name, I understood why the light had felt like waiting. It had been waiting for me to be ready. He was there. I'm not going to tell you I saw his face the way you'd see a face in a photograph or across a room. It wasn't visual in that way. It was more like the entire history of a person. Everything they were. Everything they meant to you. Every morning they existed in the same world as you, compressed into a single point of recognition that arrives all at once, fully and without warning. And it arrived. Whatever had been locked in my chest for 7 years cracked open in that moment, not painfully, not the way grief usually arrives, which is sharp and disorienting and makes you feel like the ground has shifted under your feet. This was something else entirely, more like the release of a breath you had been holding so long you had forgotten you were holding it at all. He knew I was there. I knew he was there. And then something happened that I have thought about every single day since I came back. He didn't speak in words. I want to be precise about this because the precision matters. There was no voice, no mouth, no sentence constructed the way sentences are built in this world. What there was instead was a transmission. That's the only word I've found that comes anywhere close. A direct transfer of meaning that bypassed every layer of misunderstanding that language usually carries between people. What came through was this: you are not finished. 4 words, if I had to render them in language. But receiving them was nothing like reading 4 words on a page. It was more like being handed the entire weight of your own life, past, present, everything still unlived, and understanding in a single instant that the weight had a purpose, that it had always had one, that the leaving was not abandonment, that the silence of 7 years had not been absence. He had been there. He said, and I'll try to hold on to how this felt as I say it, he said that there were things I still needed to do, not in the way of obligation or duty, more in the way of completion, like a sentence that ends in the middle of a word and leaves the reader suspended, waiting for something to finally land. I was that sentence, and it wasn't finished. I want to tell you that I felt peace in that moment. I did. But I want to be honest about the other thing I felt underneath the peace, the thing I didn't expect to find in a place like that, which was a kind of ache I had no name for, because I didn't want to go back. I understood that I had to. I could feel it the way you feel the approach of morning when you're in a sleep you didn't want to end. Not as a decision, but as a tide, something already moving whether you choose it or not. But I didn't want to. Not because I was afraid of the life waiting for me on the other side of that choice, because I was afraid of losing this. Losing this. That's the thought I carried back through whatever boundary separates that place from this one. Not the wonder, not the light, not even my Father's presence, though all of those came with me in their own way, folded into the parts of me that couldn't be separated from the experience, no matter how much time passed. What I carried most clearly and most painfully was the fear of losing it. And that fear raised a question I have never fully been able to put down. If that place is real, and I'm telling you with everything in me that it is, then what are we doing here? I don't mean that as despair. I want to be clear about that because the question sounds darker than it feels. I mean it as the most genuine inquiry I have ever brought to my own life, because if there exists, beyond the body, something that warm and that complete, and that's certain of itself, then what is the purpose of this part? What is the purpose of the confusion and the loss and the years spent carrying absences we don't know how to name? What are we supposed to do with the time we're given if we know what's on the other side of it? My Father's transmission, "You are not finished," was an answer of sorts. But answers, I've learned, have a way of becoming the source of deeper questions. Because I came back. I came back and I had to figure out what not finished meant in the language of ordinary days, in the language of grocery lists and rent and the particular silence of a Tuesday afternoon when nothing is wrong, but nothing is quite right either. That translation from what I'd seen to how I was supposed to live is the hardest work I have ever done. Harder than the physical recovery, harder than relearning to move through a body that had been stopped and restarted, harder than explaining to the people around me why I wasn't the same person who had walked out of that apartment on the night of March 14th, and why I needed them to stop expecting him back. I tried in those first weeks to tell people what had happened. Some of them listened, with a kind of careful politeness I recognized as not believing. The face stays open while the eyes go somewhere else. Some of them cried. A few told me about their own experiences, a feeling of presence in a room after someone died. A dream so real they woke up certain they had been somewhere. A moment at the edge of sleep when a voice said something clear and then was gone. One woman, a nurse on the recovery ward, not from the emergency team, stopped me in the middle of a sentence one afternoon and said quietly that she had seen this before. Not my story exactly, but the thing underneath my story, the same particular quality in the eyes of someone who had come back from a certain kind of distance, the same stillness that isn't passivity. It's more like the stillness of a person who has been given an answer to a question they didn't consciously know they were carrying. She told me that in her years on that ward, the patients who returned from the furthest out were always the calmest afterward. Not sedated, not in shock. Calm in the way of someone who no longer needs to perform certainty because they have found the real thing. I held on to what she said because there were days in the months that followed when the memory of that place felt like it was receding, when the weight of ordinary life pressed up against the clarity I had brought back, and I found myself afraid I was losing the thread, that the brightness was dimming, that I would end up with a story I couldn't verify and a life I didn't know how to justify. The question then wasn't what had happened to me. The question was whether I could hold it, whether a person could live inside the ordinary world and also carry knowledge of that other one, without the two things crushing each other, without the brightness of what I had seen making everything here feel like a lesser version of something I'd been forced to leave. That is the question I was still sitting with when something unexpected happened, something that changed the question entirely. 6 months after I came home from the hospital, I went back to my father's house, not the house I grew up in. He had moved after my parents separated when I was in high school into a smaller place on the edge of town that I had visited maybe a dozen times in the years before he passed. A grey house with a porch that needed repainting and a garden he had apparently been tending with some care, though I never saw it in full bloom because he left before the season turned. His sister, my Aunt Clara, still lived there. She had moved in to help with the property after he died and never quite left. That was the kind of woman she was. She stayed where she was needed and asked nothing in return and never made you feel the weight of what she had given up to be there. I hadn't seen her since the day of the funeral. She opened the door before I could knock, the way she always had when I was a child, as if she had been watching the street or as if she simply knew. She looked at me for a moment without speaking, and then she said, "I wondered when you'd come. Not, 'I'm surprised to see you.' Not, 'I heard what happened to you.' I wondered when you'd come." As if my arrival was something that had always been scheduled, just without a confirmed date on anyone's calendar. We sat at the kitchen table the way you do in that kind of house, with tea that was too strong and a plate of something neither of us really touched, and she asked me to tell her, so I did. I told her everything. More than I had told anyone else since it happened, because with Clara, I had never needed to edit what I said before I said it. She had that quality, the same quality, I realized as I spoke, that my father had always carried. A patience that was not passive, a way of listening that made the person talking feel like what they were saying was worth the care of getting it exactly right. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. And then she told me something I have turned over in my hands every single day since. She told me that in the last weeks before my father died, he had talked about me. Not the way parents sometimes talk about their children, recounting stories, expressing worry, going over old ground. He had talked about me the way you talk about something unresolved, something still in motion that you haven't found the ending for. He said, and Clara repeated this carefully, the way you repeat something you've been holding for a long time and are only now permitted to set down, he said that he felt there was something he hadn't finished with me, something he had meant to say and hadn't found the right moment for through all the years we had both been walking around in the same world. He said it more than once. I sat with that for a long moment. He had felt it too. On this side, in the ordinary language of ordinary days, he had felt exactly the same thing I experienced in that space beyond. The incompleteness, the sentence cut short, the thing between two people that never found its way into words. He had been carrying it, and I had been carrying the other half of it, and neither of us had known how to cross the distance between us to say it out loud. That understanding arrived in me like something heavy being set down after a long carry. Not grief exactly, something more complicated than grief, because it changed what I understood about the message. You are not finished hadn't only been about me and what I still needed to do with my remaining years. It had been about us, about something unspoken between a father and a son that had needed the extraordinary distance of one crossing over and the stranger circumstance of the other briefly following before it could finally be said. I drove home from Clara's house in silence. No music, no voice in the background, just the road and the late afternoon light falling across everything in that way it has just before it shifts into something else. Somewhere on that drive, the question changed. It was no longer, can I hold what I saw? It became, what am I supposed to do with the fact that he was trying to reach me too? That question has stayed with me. But the answer I've found, but the part of it I've been able to find, is not what I expected. The answer I didn't expect was this. It wasn't one thing. I think I had been waiting, through those long months of recovery and questioning, for a single revelation. The moment when everything clicked into place and I understood precisely what I had been sent back to do. The decisive act. The clear purpose, the mission handed down in language I couldn't misread or misapply. That's not what happened. What happened was smaller than that, and stranger, and in the end more true than any single turning point moment could have been. It started with the way I listened to people. I noticed it first with a co-worker, a man named Gerald, older than me by about 20 years, who worked the same warehouse shift I returned to once I was cleared to go back. Gerald was the kind of man who talked to fill silence, not because he had a surplus of things to say, but because quiet made him uncomfortable in a way he had never examined and no one around him had thought to ask about. Most people half listened to Gerald. You learned the rhythm of him and responded at the intervals that kept him moving without really receiving any of it. I started actually listening, not performing listening, actually receiving what he was saying. And what I found underneath the habit and the filler was a man who was profoundly lonely in a way he had no vocabulary for, who had outlived two people he loved and hadn't told anyone what that had cost him, who came to work every single day and talked to fill the space those two people used to occupy. I didn't say anything dramatic about this. I didn't pull Gerald aside and have a conversation that rearranged his life. What I did was stay present with him in a way I wouldn't have known how to do before March 14th. I asked him one question one afternoon about his wife, whose name I had heard him mention once and then drop, the way you drop something you're not ready to look at directly. And I listened to the answer without preparing my own response while he spoke. He cried a little, just briefly, then laughed at himself for it, then thanked me in a way that felt out of proportion to what I had done, which was almost nothing at all. But that's exactly what I mean. The not finished wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about a dramatic act I had been specifically selected to perform. It was about presence, about the particular and irreplaceable thing a human being offers when they are fully in the room with another human being. Not half elsewhere, not managing the clock in their head, not waiting for the moment to be over. Just there. I had never really been there before, not fully, not without some part of me already moving toward the next thing. I had been performing connection my entire life without understanding what connection actually required of me, and it took 4 minutes and 31 seconds of being somewhere else entirely to teach me what it meant to be here. That understanding didn't arrive as a single moment. It accumulated across months, across dozens of small exchanges with people I would once have moved past without stopping. The way real understanding usually arrives, not as a lightning bolt, but as a gradual brightening that you only recognize in hindsight. And then, about a year after the accident, something happened that made all of it undeniable. I was walking late at night, not the same road, but the same kind, moving through the city without a destination the way I had always moved when I needed to think, and I came across a man sitting on a curb outside a closed convenience store, head down, entirely still. Old Vinney would have kept walking. Something, I don't have a cleaner word for it, and I've stopped trying to find one, made me stop, made me cross the space between us and sit down on that curb beside him, without asking permission or offering an explanation. We sat there for a while without speaking, and then he started to talk. What came out of him, slowly and haltingly, in the way of someone who has been holding something for far too long, in far too small a space, was a story I was not prepared for. A story that reached all the way back to what my father had said to me in the light. His name was Marcus. He had been sitting on that curb for 2 hours, he told me. He had called his brother earlier in the evening, called him 3 times and gotten no answer, and then he had simply stopped, sat down, and waited for something to shift, or for nothing to shift, whichever came first. He had lost his father 8 months before. Sudden, no warning. The kind of loss that leaves the surviving person standing in the middle of their own life, wondering how the landscape could look so identical when everything that gave it meaning is gone. He hadn't told anyone how bad it had gotten. He was 24 years old, and he was carrying the weight of it alone. The way men that age learn to carry weight, sideways, in silence, refusing to acknowledge the load until the knees give out. I sat on that curb and I listened to him talk for a long time. I didn't tell him about March 14th, not right away. I didn't lead with what I had seen or where I had been, because that wasn't what he needed in those first minutes. What he needed was what Gerald had needed, what I was beginning to understand most people need, long before they need any particular wisdom. He needed someone to be there. So I was there, and at some point, after the worst of it had moved through him after the particular kind of silence that comes after a person has said the thing they most needed to say. I told him a little of what had happened to me, not all of it, the parts that might reach him. I told him that I had been somewhere I couldn't fully describe, and that while I was there I had understood something about his father, not his specifically. I didn't know his father, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But about fathers, about what it means when the thing between two people doesn't get finished in the time they're given. I told him, the love doesn't stop when they stop breathing. I know that sounds like something people say, but I'm telling you from somewhere else. I know it the way I know my own name. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said something I wasn't expecting. He said, "My father used to say he wasn't done with me yet." Those words, that exact construction, not finished, not done. The same transmission arrived through a different man in a different life, on a curb outside a closed store in the dark. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. I just sat with the weight of it, the extraordinary, unmanageable weight of a coincidence that wasn't a coincidence, and let it mean what it meant. If you've made it this far with me, subscribe to the channel. New stories like this one every week, because here is what I have come to understand. My father wasn't the only one waiting in that light. When I was zipped into that bag, when the decision had been made and the body had been prepared and the machinery of death had completed its first gesture, something on the other side was not finished with me, not my father alone, something larger than that, something that keeps its own accounting of what is complete and what still needs to happen. And when they pulled me back, when the paddles and the hands and the 4 minutes and 31 seconds gave way to a pulse, I came back different. Not in a way that shows on the outside, not in a way you'd notice passing me on the street. Different in the way of someone who has been to the place where you see how everything connects and then has had to figure out what to do with that seeing in a world that mostly moves too fast to stop and ask. Marcus and I exchanged numbers that night on the curb. He called me a few weeks later, his voice different, lighter in a specific way, the way a voice sounds when something that was clenched has started to release. He said, "I think I needed that night." I said, "I think I did too," because that is what not finished looks like from the inside. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with clarity and direction. It looks like a man you almost walked past, and a question you almost didn't ask, and a silence you almost didn't sit with long enough for something true to come through it. It looks like being exactly where you are when you are almost somewhere else entirely. Almost somewhere else entirely. I've thought about that phrase for years now. The strange grammar of almost. The paper-thin distance between what happened and what could have happened. Between a body bag zipped closed in a hospital corridor and a man still moving through the world, stopping at curbs, asking questions, staying present long enough to hear the answers. There is a version of March 14th where the pulse doesn't come back. I'm aware of that version every single day. Not with dread, not anymore. With something closer to gratitude, though that word doesn't fully carry the weight of what I mean by it. Something more like reverence for the specific and unearned accident of still being here, for the gift, and I have no more precise word for it, of more time. More time to get things wrong and then get them right and then get them wrong again in new ways that turn out to matter in ways the old ways didn't. I didn't earn my way back. I want to be clear about that. I didn't deserve a second chance more than the person who doesn't get one. I have made my peace with not understanding why the line gets drawn where it does. Why some people get 4 minutes and 31 seconds and a return, and some people don't, and what the difference is, if difference is even the right frame for something operating at that scale. What I know is only what I was given. A moment on the other side that was more real than anything I had experienced in the 26 years before it. A presence I recognized before I had the language to name what I was recognizing. A transmission that arrived without words and has been asking to be translated into words ever since. You are not finished. And after the transmission, a life. A life that had to be rebuilt from the inside out in the quiet and unglamorous way that real rebuilding always happens. Not with revelation and fanfare, with small decisions, with questions asked and silences held, with a man named Gerald who needed someone to actually listen to him talk about his wife, with a man named Marcus on a curb in the dark who carried half a sentence his father had left unfinished, and who found the other half of it on a night when he had stopped expecting anything to arrive. With my Aunt Clara sitting across a kitchen table, releasing something she had been holding for years, on the chance that I was finally ready to receive it. With all the ordinary moments I would have walked through unseeing before. I think about my father differently now than I did in the 7 years between his passing and that night on the road. Not as an absence, not as a loss I learned to carry at a manageable distance, more as someone who went ahead, who got there first, and left something in the space between us. Not a conventional message, not words written down where I could find them, a direction, a quiet and persistent pointing toward, an insistence which I feel now more clearly with every year that passes, that what happens between people is the thing. Not the ambitions or the accomplishments or the ways we mark our passage through time, the actual contact between one human being and another, the moment of real presence, the willingness to sit down on a curb and stay. He knew that while he was still alive, he was trying to say it and didn't find the moment. And then he said it the only way that was left to him, in a place beyond the body where the saying and the receiving happen at the same time and nothing gets lost in translation. I don't know everything about what lies on the other side. I only know what I experienced, and what I experienced was one man's 4 minutes and 31 seconds in one kind of beyond. But it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the most certain thing I have ever known, in a life that has had very little certainty in it, and it changed. Not the world, but the way I moved through it, which, it turns out, is the same thing. There's another story waiting. We took 100 accounts, 100 people who crossed over and came back, and we laid them side by side. Every detail, every place where the stories converge in ways that resist coincidence, what they all saw, what they all heard, and the one thing every single one of them brought back, without exception. That one's already there when you're ready. If this story reached you, subscribe and leave it a like. It's how others find their way here, and we have more to share.